Father in heaven, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for your word, for all that you would have us to learn about your servant David this morning. We ask that you give us clarity of mind and heart to hear and to see all that you would have for us to learn. In Christ Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I'm sweating this morning already. I'm thinking that the subject matter has made my vestments all the warmer this morning. And so, forgive me. I'm closing in on a year of being here, and Ian and I have a fantastic relationship, and it's been great for me to work with him and for us to work together on a lot of things. And I have what I would call a touch of maybe St. Peter's disease, in the sense that I often say sometimes the first thing that comes to mind without filtering it properly or without necessarily putting it in the best context, so to speak. And so I'm often accused of being a superhero of sorts. I'm called Captain Sensitivity. And as we were parsing out what we were going to do this summer, Ian came to me one day with a kind of a distraught look on his face. I said, "What's wrong?" He goes, "I don't know how or why, but somehow I gave you David and Bathsheba. And you got to make sure that Captain Sensitivity is kept at bay that day." And I said, okay, we will. And then there was a small glimmer of hope, because actually we were supposed to be on vacation this week initially, and Ian thought, yes, finally, a way out without just taking it from him. But nevertheless, plans changed, and here we are. So we will journey together this morning, and I will do all that I can to keep Captain Sensitivity at bay. My youngest daughter, Bethany, goes around singing a little song that'll be well known to anyone that's grown up in the Christian faith. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. Be careful, little hands, what you do. And be careful, little feet, where you go. And of course, as with all children's songs about the faith, there's a massive oversimplification, but there's also a strong grain of truth. The whole point of the song is it's an encouragement for us to guard our character by protecting our eyes, protecting our ears, protecting our hearts, and protecting our hands and feet. It's a petition for us to be doing the things that we should in order that we would avoid the things that we should not. A call to avoid sin by avoiding temptation itself. And perhaps this little pithy song would have served King David some good as he went about that fateful stroll on that warm Jerusalem afternoon. The text for today is a familiar one that you've heard many sermons on, I'm sure. The story of David and Bathsheba. It's one of the best known stories in the Bible for a reason. However, I hope that today we can take a fresh look at it and glean from the Scriptures all that God would have for us to learn. Now, the scene is set first with David being in a city when we think that he should be out in battle. And one of the hallmarks of good preaching and a good preacher is being able to stand in front of you and let you know when they've made a mistake, even if it was unintentional, in a reading of the text in the past. So I definitely want to stand here this morning and tell you that many times I've taught on David and Bathsheba and always started out with, if David had just been doing what he was supposed to do, it all wouldn't have happened if he'd been out with the armies at battle. But in all actuality, the structure of the Hebrew text is not written to emphasize that this is the time when kings go out to battle. It's written to emphasize that it's springtime, that it's a certain date. The reason why that's important is because 2 Samuel is not written chronologically. But if you go back and compare it with 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are more chronological, you will find out that already at this point in David's life, his men, his generals, have asked him to stop leading them in battle. Even though that's what the people wanted, that's what they wanted a king for, they told David, please don't go out with us anymore in battle. The reason being is that, unfortunately, the monarchy in Israel had been much more like a Game of Thrones so far than a real dynasty. There hadn't been a peaceful handing down. There hadn't been a succession, so to speak. It's not like Saul gave the kingdom to his son. The kingdom was taken from him. There had been no stability. And all the kingdoms around Israel were much older in terms of their monarchies, and they had these dynasties in place. And so David's men knew that David's rule was so important that they didn't want him to fall by accident in some minor battle. They're like, you just stay here, do what you're supposed to do here in the city, and let us take care of the battles. And so that's what had happened. And so the point being made here is not that David should have been out with the men, but the point is that David has actually been planning this attack for a long time. If you go back a couple of previous chapters, there's one time that David's army is routed, and it's by the Ammonites. It's by this very people. And he remembers the anniversary of this battle, and he sends out his men to engage them again on the very anniversary of his defeat. He besieges their city. He does all of this in sort of a revenge battle. So that's the setting. That's that initial bit that's going on here when we open up into this chapter. And so the point being is that David's in the middle of a strategically planned battle, something he's thought out well. And the story progresses, in the opening scene is this: David gets up from his midday rest and he goes out in the afternoon to the rooftops. And I want to emphasize that this too is perfectly natural, perfectly innocent, so to speak. The way life would have worked at that point is, in the heat of the day, you would have taken a nap, and then you would have gotten up and went outside to seek relief from that unbearable heat. And there's no air conditioning, and perhaps the wind can't make its way through every part of the house. And so the best place to seek the cool of the day is actually on the rooftop. They're up there enjoying the breeze that's generated after the hottest portion of the day. And then David's on the rooftop, and he sees Bathsheba bathing. And even though that sounds kind of crazy on Bathsheba's part to you and I, that's not uncommon. Houses in the ancient world would have had a bath in one of two places, either the courtyard or the rooftop, both of which would have been in public. Now, you and I live in houses with bathrooms with doors and frosted glass and everything else. But in the ancient world, apparently taking a bath was not a big deal in front of everybody. Either you went to a public bathhouse or you took a bath in public in front of everybody at home. So even in that, Bathsheba is innocent. She's not doing anything. David's not doing anything, so to speak. She's just actually obeying the law. And that's the way that Bathsheba is presented here. The fact that she is cleansing herself ritually from her uncleanness, she is being presented as obeying the law. She is doing all that she should be doing. She's not being presented in any way as alluring to David or in any way trying to, captivate the mind of the king. She happens to be beautiful. And if David had simply just observed and walked away, he could have been guilty of being a peeping Tom. But in a culture where everybody bathed in public, is that a crime? No one knows. So that's the best we could have said. But of course we know David doesn't leave it as there, does he? David pursues her. David asks about who is this beautiful woman, pursues her, forces her, because she is his vassal servant, into sexual relations with him, and then has to commit murder to cover his tracks. But I'm moving ahead of myself, and I want to back up and paint a bigger picture. The Scriptures are a beautifully crafted piece of literature, far more connected and nuanced than you and I, as English readers, will ever be able to comprehend. But for someone reading the Hebrew Scriptures in their original Hebrew order of books, the Old Testament is written in such a way to tell one story, to tell the story of Israel in her blessings and cursings, in her exiles and in her return. And today is just such a passage. But let me show you how this works. All the way back in Deuteronomy 28 and 30, Moses is laying out for the people the conditions of the covenant. He's laying out before them. He tells them, I lay before you today blessings and curses. Blessings. If they will obey all that is written in the law with all of their heart, then God will richly bless them, and they will inhabit the land, and they will live at peace in the land that God has given them. But he warns them that if they disobey the law and all that is written in there, they will experience God's curses that will ultimately lead to exile from the land itself. And Moses goes ahead and shows his power as a prophet, telling the people that God will bless you when you return from exile. So despite laying out before them blessings and curses, he knows what they're going to choose. They will choose curses, but he gives them a glimmer of hope that when you return from exile, God will still bless you. And this warning today serves as a template for the rest of the characters that you and I encounter in the Scriptures. And this is particularly important for the role that the kings of Israel play, because each of those kings represents the country in a microcosm. It is as if all of Israel is wrapped up in that figure, the king. So 1st and 2nd Samuel have been crafted like this in a way that tell the stories of the kings of Israel in a way to retell that story of Israel, that story of exile and return. It's painfully obvious in Saul, but it's present in David as well. The story of David's reign begins with him being presented as a man after God's own heart, being that man that obeys the law, does what he should do. He would not kill Saul, even when the kingdom had been given to him already. He wouldn't do that. You know, several weeks ago, we looked at David's first act after being made king of all Israel and Judah, and it was to attack another country. And I pointed out to you then that that was a way of Samuel, of the text, presenting David as a law-keeping king. He was doing all that the law commanded him to do. And because of that, we embarked on about a 5 or 6 chapter journey of God pouring out his blessings on David, as David was doing all that the king should do under the law. But everything's not all well, because even in those 5 or 6 chapters, David has been laying a foundation for his own undoing. The encounter with Bathsheba, it's not a one-off event. It's not that type of affair that happens when someone's out of town on business and 2 people are drunk and something that shouldn't happen happens. It's not that at all. David is unfortunately acting on a new set of character traits that he's been developing for a while now. And they lead him into the very curses that we talked about from Deuteronomy. Beginning with today's text, from chapter 5 all the way through basically to chapter 16 or 17, you're going to see David as the man that's not following after the law, as the man that instead of having the blessings of God is going to experience the curses of God. That's going to end with David in exile from Jerusalem, while his own son, Absalom, leads a rebellion against him in his absence. And this is exactly what we should expect, is it not? If you remember when we started this journey into 1 Samuel, Samuel gave a very, very strong warning about what life would be like under the king, did he not? And we saw that the king would take your sons, he's going to take your money, he's going to take your land, he's going to take your servants. And there's a little line in there where he's going to take your daughters to be his wives, to be his concubines, to serve him in his house. Of course, we saw this with Saul, but it's something that David couldn't escape from as well. You know, David's kind of marital life all started well with King Saul's daughter, Michal. She was David's first wife. And I can't take full credit for what I'm about to say here, because Ian kind of walked the vestry through this week and gave me this train of thought. But I learned a long time ago as a preacher that if another man's bullet will fit your gun, then by all means, fire it. So I am going to steal Ian's bullet and fire it this morning. David is given Michal in marriage as a way for Saul to sort of ride the coattails of God's blessings. Saul can look at David and know that David is getting these great blessings from the Lord, and he wants that to be a part of his house, so he gives him his daughter in marriage to kind of wed David into his house. And all starts out well. David and Michal seem to love each other greatly, to the point that Michal becomes uniquely devoted to David, defending him even against her own father. In one of these great episodes, you see something of her character, her love for David revealed, but also kind of the root of this whole problem. It's time for David to flee from King Saul, and Michal is able to take an idol that is so big that she can put it in her bed and cover its head with goat hair, and it passed for King David. An idol that big. The foundation is being laid now that idolatry is entering into David's life through his wives. You see, David goes into exile, and he's of course then exiled from Michal. He doesn't have her love. And the story unfolds that he begins to marry other women. So he marries a prophetess of sorts from the north. marries another, until finally by the time he enters Jerusalem and takes Michal back from another man that she's been given to in his absence. But doesn't take her back into his heart to love her. He simply sort of takes her back almost as property, as if something had been taken from him that he wants back. But their love is kind of never restored. David goes on to have many more wives and many more concubines, doing the very thing that Samuel said the king would do. And no doubt, some of these relationships are little more than a way to seal a treaty. In the ancient world, David conquered many peoples. And sometimes after the battle was over, in a way to ensure that there would be lasting peace, the king of the defeated nation would offer the winning king one of his daughters in marriage. Just kind of a way to seal the deal, so to speak. So many of these women may have come into David's life that way, little more than a trophy. No real genuine love, just another woman in his harem. Just another woman in his harem. So as David's been walking down this path, and with these women come their foreign gods and the introduction of idolatry, David's heart is slowly walked away from the Lord, to the point that he's got all these wives and all these concubines. What's one more? What is Bathsheba? So long before David's fateful afternoon walk, he had already begun to move away from the Lord with these actions toward the many women in his life. The foundation for David's sinful actions with Bathsheba was laid far before that fateful walk, that hot Jerusalem afternoon. You know how the rest of the story goes. David seeks out information about Bathsheba, finds out something very important. This is not a throwaway line. The guy says, "Is this not the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And for you and I, that may seem just like useless information. But if you look ahead into 2 Samuel 23, you'll find a list of David's mighty warriors, men that would do anything for David. In fact, there's a story, we won't get to preach on it during this series, and we both kind of regretted it, about David's mighty men. There's a story where David is sitting in exile, and all he wants is water from the well in Bethlehem. He just wants water from that well. And 3 of his mighty warriors are sitting there, and they're like, "Well, by God, we'll get some of that water." And so they go out and they engage in this fierce battle, and they slay all kind of Philistines and do all kind of stuff and bring him back a chalice full of water. And David looks at them and pours the water out in their presence and says, "I cannot drink this water that was gained with the bloodshed and the risk of the lives of my mighty men." His mighty men, his Navy SEALs, so to speak. And as you go through that list of these mighty warriors, you're going to come to a name, Ahithophel. And if you were to do some research on this person, Ahithophel, you would find out that he's one of David's primary generals, one of his chief advisors. He's also the father of a man. This man's name is Eliam. And Eliam is the father of Bathsheba. So we're talking about the granddaughter of David's chief advisor, the daughter of one of his colonels or lieutenants in his army, and then the wife of one of his primary warriors, Uriah the Hittite. A Hittite. A person that technically should have been killed, but had given his loyalty to David and was so more righteous than David that it actually makes you sick. That even in his drunken state, Uriah is more honorable than the king of Israel. Uriah the Hittite, the loyal foreigner, and King David, the disloyal son of Israel. And so David, despite knowing that this is the granddaughter of his chief advisor, continues to pursue a woman that must be maybe at best 1/4 of his age. 1/4 of his age, the very prized possession, so to speak, of Uriah, as Nathan, when he comes to confront David, presents her as a little ewe lamb. Very prize of Uriah's eye, so to speak. And of course, you know what happens. He forces her to have sexual relations with him. She has no out. She has no power against the advances of the king. And their union bears fruit with pregnancy. For the Scriptures, in all of their detail here, tell us that it was her most fertile time. That's the whole point of them telling you that she's bathing from her ritual uncleanness. And so while theology remains a Victorian enterprise that is perfectly categorized and clean and tidy, the Bible itself remains wild and unfettered, full of stories that should best not be said in public sometimes. But that is what we have this morning. So David's sin with Bathsheba, the subsequent murder of Uriah, begins a downward spiral that ends with David in exile. And David's actions affect his entire family, so that his own son, Absalom, who David loves, engages in rebellion that ends right where David's began. You may not know this, but if you read it all the way out into 2 Samuel, you'll find that David's son, Absalom, has this horrible rebellion that ends with him taking David's wives and concubines for himself. And where does this happen? Where does this happen? Absalom sets up a tent on the rooftop. The very rooftop where David had feasted his eyes upon Bathsheba is the fruit of David's rebellion. And who encourages Absalom to engage in this vile act? If you read the text, you'll find that it's a man named Ahithophel. And who is Ahithophel? He is the grandfather of Bathsheba. So now, years removed from David's rape and manipulation of his granddaughter, Ahithophel is able to take vengeance by encouraging David's own son to engage in an act so vile that God can only move in judgment upon him. Did David anticipate all of that on that afternoon stroll? Most certainly not. But he should have known, just like Moses, that today God was setting before him blessings and curses. And when it came to Bathsheba, David chose curses. So what is the lesson that we should take away from the life of David? Is it something as simple and clear as to do not commit adultery? Well, yeah, that's part of it, but do we need this story to teach us that? Do we not have the commandments to teach us clearly? No, there's something a little more here that I want you to see. And it's this. More often than not, you and I have far too high of a view of the biblical characters that we often study. We see them as vastly more spiritual than we are, more godly, somehow different than you and I. But this picture of David, we get a reminder that the fall runs right through the heart of every human being. Every man, woman, and child that has ever existed. David is just like us, and we are just like David. And that means we are complex moral creatures that sometimes do the right thing, and sometimes we do not. And to complicate that matter even fully, there apparently is no rhyme nor reason as to why sometimes we will do what we should and sometimes we will not. Much like the Apostle Paul, we find ourselves knowing the law of God in our minds but unable to obey it in our members. No rhyme nor reason, no pattern to when we'll do what's right and when we'll do what's wrong. But with David, I think we can get a glimpse into some kind of pattern that is at work. We said earlier this morning that the foundation for David's fall with Bathsheba was laid long before that afternoon walk. And that's what you have to keep in mind. Long before you and I fall into some major catastrophic sin, we will have made a million other small choices that make that final decision all that easier. David fell into adultery. And that's more than likely not going to be a major problem for most people in this room. But we can't forget that David's life is also a picture of the nation, a microcosm of the whole. David's adultery is just a single manifestation of the larger problem of idolatry. Have you ever even stopped to think about how similar those words even sound in your ear? A connection being made, infidelity to one's spouse versus infidelity to one's God. So he begins to slide away from the Lord with these actions surrounding his multiple wives. And in that situation that he had created for himself, what was one more girl? A tent full of wives and concubines. What's Bathsheba? I'll just take her. He thought it would be nothing. But it turned out to be a scenario where his actions not only set his own life on fire, but the whole nation was turned upside down. And the same thing happens with us if we put anything, more often than not, ourselves in the place of God. G.K. Bill points out the first law of the spiritual world is that you will become like what you worship. And if you or I worship ourselves, then we are following a very lesser God. A God that cannot save, a God that cannot forgive, a God that cannot restore, and ultimately a God that cannot satisfy. Sure, you and I may not drag down an entire nation with us, but we can still make a big mess. So I hope by now you're saying, okay, Donnie, where's the good news? Where's the gospel in all of this? Well, we haven't finished the story. Sure, we've discovered that David is just like us with his penchant to create a mess and to commit great sins. He has fallen like we are and subject to having to face the consequences of our sins. Yes, you and I will fail just like David failed. There's no escaping that this side of Jesus' second coming. But we can make a decision to be like David in another amazing way. The story continues, with God's prophet Nathan coming to David to confront him over his sin with Bathsheba. And David's reaction here is instructive for you and I today. If you have a keen mind, this very confrontation has happened again just a few chapters ago. When Saul failed to do what he should do in battle, and Samuel came to him and confronted Saul, Saul, rather than accepting his responsibility and repenting, tries to blame everybody else and only wants to save face. David, in the presence of all his